Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning. I'd like to welcome you again to our session. And I tell you, we are really excited. My name is Charleston Carter, and I'm the trial court administrator for the 26th District, which is Mecklenburg County. And I want you to know that this session is live. So whenever you have a question, hopefully I can bring the microphone to you. And if not, our great presenter, who's no other than Dr. Hartt, who's the director of the National Center for State Courts as it relates to the knowledge and information services. But I have to make sure that you know, this particular session is about pushing buttons. I wonder how many of your buttons have been pushed. But Dr. Hartt has a way of approach as it relates to a common sense, whether it's enhancing individually or as an organization. Please let us hear what he has to say. Welcome, Dr. Hartt.
Thank you. Thank you, Charleston. We should just let him do the rest of the presentation, to be honest. All right, well, welcome everybody. Thank you for choosing this session. This is live stream, so if you have a question, just ask the question. I want it to be fairly conversational, and I'll repeat the question so the folks who are attending virtually can hear the question as well. Let's wave to them all back there. We know you're out there, so thank you for coming. I want this to be about you folks, so the first thing I want you to do is take a minute and introduce yourself to somebody you may not know. Answer those quick questions with them, maybe exchange a business card if you choose. Good morning. You're going to need that. Okay. All right, if I can get you back.
Thank you so
Nice you made
much.
a new friend. If I can get you back for a second. That's good. Did we exchange any business cards? All right, good. Good. Next thing I want you to do, this is where your sticky note comes in to play. I want you to think back to your current or your last job and write down the biggest thing that kept you from doing your job. It can be a word, a phrase, a sentence. If it's much more than a sentence, you have totally overthunk this. All right, so it should be the first thing that comes to your mind. The biggest thing that kept you from doing your job.
You said in the last job?
Current or last job, your choice. If you're here with your boss, that's why I give that as an option. Now this is the important part. When you're finished with those sticky notes, I need you to affix them firmly to your forehead. Okay?
Your forehead.
I'm not seeing many on foreheads yet. If they won't stick, that means you have some T-zone issues you can resolve later. All right, we're getting there. A word, a phrase, sentence, and then stuck to your forehead. All right. Excellent. Now I want you to look at each other and see how ridiculous you look. And you can think back whether you want to pull your business card back from these people. All right, so Now I need all those sticky notes brought to the center and then down front. And we'll get back to those in a minute. So Charleston did a great job introducing me, but I want to tell you a little bit about me and my experience, okay? So the first thing about me is I've never worked in a court. Why am I here? I'm a non-lawyer, to quote the lawyers. How many other non-lawyers in the room? All right, good. I've only been in a courtroom 3 times. I was acquitted all 3 times. No, it was for real estate stuff. And the other thing is they were all terrible experiences every time I had to go to court. So let's talk about my qualifications for this presentation. I've never worked in a court. I'm a non-lawyer. I've only been to court 3 times, and they were all terrible experiences. So how does that make me qualified to talk about improving performance in the judiciary?
It doesn't have to be a court. It can improve your performance anywhere.
Right. That's right. The other thing it does, it gives, who's been working in the courts the longest here? Anybody over 30 years? 35? 40? 45? All right, so we're in there somewhere. Okay. Let me give you a little bit more background. I have a doctorate in organizational leadership. I spent 23 years as a military officer, retired as a senior officer in the Coast Guard. Like many folks, like many military officers, when you retire, you're lured by what we call beltway bandits, government contractors, right? So I spent 4 years as an executive in the aerospace and defense industry, and there's always this balance between what feeds your wallet and what feeds your soul. Job fed my wallet really well, didn't feed my soul so much. And then I had an opportunity to teach at George Washington University in a graduate program. And we sort of did the opposite. Fed my soul really well, didn't feed my wallet so much. And now I find myself in the nonprofit world. So I've spent time in the public sector, the private sector, academia, and now nonprofit working for the National Center. I think the only thing left is the clergy, and the Lord knows that's not going to happen anytime soon. All right, so I've seen lots of organizations, and I sort of study organizations for a living. And I've seen some interesting things as I've been watching and listening and hearing things about the courts. And the great thing about working at the National Center is all that stuff comes up to us. We see what's going on, or at least we think we see what's going on. We hear sort of the hot buttons and the hot points. And one of my observations is that change is fairly slow in the courts. Do we agree with that? Yes. One of the things I was told as people were explaining the courts to me, they said, well, courts and hospitals are kind of the same. I said, what? How are they the same? Well, in a hospital, you have a chief medical officer, right? And then you have a hospital administrator. In the courts, we have our chief judge, justice, and then we have the court administrator. Okay, that makes sense to me. Then this analogy got more interesting, because if we look at a surgeon from the 18th century, and if we were to put them in a surgical suite of today, do you think they'd be able to operate? No. Technology has changed so much. The way we interact with our doctors and our healthcare has changed dramatically since the 18th century. If we put a lawyer from the 18th century in a courtroom of today, would they be able to more or less operate? You're saying yes, okay? And I kind of agree with you. We look at the human body since the 18th century, it hasn't changed. We look at law since the 18th century, probably hasn't changed much more, right? Now, some people say that's great. That shows the stability of the third branch of government, and it's so critical and important for our democracy, which I don't disagree with, right? But the world has also changed. So I go back to my been in a courtroom 3 times, and they're all terrible experiences. I may not be the smartest guy, but I'm pretty well educated, and me going to court was awful. It was terrible. So I come to this from the customer experience, not from you folks who know the inner workings and the machinations of how it's supposed to work, which sometimes makes it hard. Sometimes we're so busy driving, it's hard to stop and think about getting gas, right? I just got to keep driving, got to keep driving. Doesn't matter if the needle's going to E. I got to keep driving, and I'm not saying the needle's going to E, but I'm saying I bring a different perspective, that's all, okay? So this presentation is going to be sort of about my perspective. The other thing that I've seen is that this seems to be a fairly insular community of practice. You know what I mean by insular? Meaning if you don't have the right credentials after your name, JD, judge, or if it hasn't, the idea didn't bubble up within the court community, we don't give it maybe the same credence. Would we agree with that? The not invented here syndrome, not invented here, we're not really paying attention to it. And there's a whole body of stuff that's going on in the outside in business organizations. And I get it, you're not a business. And that's the other thing I heard about the courts. Yeah, but we're different. You are. But you're no different than the energy industry is from the financial industry, is from the healthcare industry, is from the manufacturing industry, right? They're all different. They have different needs, but they're all organizations, and they live and breathe more or less the same way and suffer from some of the same ills. There are nuances in that, no doubt, okay? So let me give you, I'm going to introduce a model in a little bit that I think, I call it a common sense approach, that can help you look at your organizations, look at your courts a little differently and say, how can we tweak them a little bit? All right? Just another tool potentially to put in your tool bag. All right. So we're talking about improving performance. That means change in some regards. So let me read this quote from George Washington. One of the difficulties in bringing about change in an organization is that you must do so through the persons who have been the most successful in that organization, no matter how faulty the system or the organization is. To such persons, you see, it is the best of all possible organizations, because look who was selected by it, and look who succeeded most in it. Yet these are the very people through whom we must bring about improvements. Now that does not apply just to the courts, okay? As I said, I spent 23 years in the military and came across lots of very senior people to me, admirals, 1, 2, 3, 4-star admirals, and that certainly applies, this quote applies to them. It applies to any organization. If you're a doctor, it applies to you as well, right? So this thing I call performance improvement. What is it and who's responsible for it? We're going to define it. How many of you consider yourselves managers? You manage at least one person. Okay? Good. Then you probably have some responsibility for improving processes and systems within your organization as well. Here are some of the organizations that do it, okay? McDonald's, that restaurant we all like to hate but don't admit we go to. Yes? Yes? And then obviously we know Lowe's, UPS, LG, Microsoft. And I was introduced to this during my days on active duty. The Coast Guard's been doing this thing we call human performance improvement or performance technology for about 40 years. And they bought into it because unlike sister services, the Air Force, the Army, and the Navy, or Marine Corps to a lesser extent, when they have problems, they smother them with people and dollars. And the Coast Guard just didn't have that. It was a service smaller than the New York City Police Department, but with a global responsibility. So when we had to fix something, or if we saw something that was an issue, we knew we were only going to get one bite at that apple, and we better fix it and fix it right the first time because there was no time or money to come back at it, okay? So it gives us a roadmap, this thing we call performance technology, gives us a roadmap to work smarter, not just harder. So let's define it. There are two associations that are sort of affiliated, have glommed onto this thing we call performance improvement or performance technology. The first one is the International Society for Performance Improvement, called ISPI. The second one is the Association for Talent Development, which used to be ASTD. Any judicial educators in the room? No, okay. ATD is, they're the 10,000-pound gorilla in the performance world, or in the training world, workforce training world, but not necessarily in the performance world. So let's define this. ISPI says it's a set of methods and processes for not only solving problems, but also realizing opportunities related to the performance of people and organizations. So when we use it to solve a problem, we're sort of in a reactive mode. When we use it to realize an opportunity, that's in a proactive mode. And I think that's why that's pretty important that we distinguish that. And then the Association for Talent Development says it's a systematic process of identifying and analyzing root causes, okay, and then implementing big picture solutions across an organization. I wouldn't disagree with that. The key to both of these, though, the focus is on factors that impact individual and organizational performance. Questions? We good on that? Okay. Here's some tenets. We say that performance improvement, performance technology, whichever term we want to use, we need to begin with the end in mind. Any Covey fans in here? Stephen Covey? Yeah, I'm a big Covey guy. That's one of Stephen Covey's big 7 habits, right? Begin with the end in mind. What should success look like? The second is it's a systemic analysis starting with identifying the optimal state. That's sort of almost the same thing as what does success look like? But it's more about making what is what ought to be. This is the way it is today. What should it look like? What ought it be? And then there's many factors. We talked about that. People and organizations, and it has to be data-driven. And I make that point because in my work before I came to the National Center, I saw a lot of decisions based on senior people with influence and an idea. Some of those ideas were good. Some of those ideas were ridiculous, right? Because they're not using data, but they're saying, based on my experience, right? But if the organization is a pie, their experience might be a small slice of that pie, and we sort of forget the rest of the organization. So if we're a court administrator, we get that part, but we don't know what it's like necessarily to be a customer. We have an idea what it might be like for a judge or somebody at a lower level. We don't have that same intimate feeling or experience on what they do. So data must rule the day. Okay. Primary causes of performance, or low performance, sorry. So you'll see, you probably can't see that in the back, but this graphic is from the Conference Board in 1994. That's pretty old. But I will tell you, this data is the same today as it was in 1994. So when we look at all the reasons that things go bad in our organization, this is a pretty good graphic. And the first one is poor or insufficient performance feedback. 60% of the problems can be related to poor or insufficient feedback. The other way to spin that is the number one way to improve somebody's performance is give them feedback. Common sense, not always common practice. The other thing that is embedded in that is that we have to give them feedback based on a standard, which is really the third thing, no performance standard. And then we had to lack of clear individual goals. How is performance rewarded? All right, let me give you an example of how this is so impactful. When I was teaching, and again I was teaching at the graduate level, I had a young lady in my class. She had been in the workforce for about 3 years, then came to study with me. But they were still working adults, right? So it wasn't a resident program. And I noticed she just took a new job and was really excited about the job, but over a period of about 6 weeks, her enthusiasm for this job faded tremendously. And I finally said, what's going on? You're not talking about this job like you used to. You're not bringing examples like you used to. She said, I've been working there for 6 weeks, and nobody has told me what I'm supposed to be doing. 6 weeks! And nobody told her what she's... This is a young lady with a bachelor's degree and several years of experience, and now she's going back for a graduate degree. And that sounds ridiculous, but that happens all too often. And what happened as a result of that? She quit. She didn't feel invested in, like, what am I doing here? They don't even think enough of me to tell me what I'm doing, right? So She didn't get feedback, obviously, but not only that, she didn't get any, what am I supposed to be doing? What's the standard? What do you need me to do for the organization? So here's a highly motivated, intelligent young lady, and she left. Bye-bye. Their loss. The other interesting point down here is low compensation. It's at the bottom. We think the way to keep people is pay them more, and there's some truth to that. But if we do a lot of these other things first, they're more likely to stay engaged in our organization and stick around longer. And I hear that about the courts all the time, right? We just can't pay them enough. There's probably some truth to that. But there's also something called the happiness index. Anybody heard of that before? Happiness index says if I give people this amount of money, it's enough for them to live in a reasonably safe place, reliable transportation, maybe put some money in a bank, but not necessarily, some, and an opportunity to have some leisure time, right? And then people who make considerably more than that dollar amount, they're no happier. If they're making exponentially more than that dollar amount, they're really no happier. So if we can provide people enough money to just sort of meet that happiness index, and that's a little different based on locality and things like that, people are usually pretty good. And if we want to keep them around, we don't necessarily have to pay them more. We have to treat them better. Engage them in the organization. All right, let's look at how work gets done. And whether this is case flow management or making widgets. All right, it's sort of the same idea. So there's some stimulus to start something. In a court, when a new case is brought, what does that stimulus look like? Somebody tell me. New case filing. Okay, so we start a new case filing. So we have to exhibit some behavior to do that. That produces some output, which contributes to the business goal. Hopefully we've identified some business goals or organizational goals. Okay? There's some other things that go with that, though, when we think about exhibiting some behavior. There are some tools that may be required. There's access to information. What does the work environment look like that we're working in? Performance standards, and have I brought the right people to do that job? Okay, so that's how work gets done. Let's look at it from a performance perspective. We actually look at it from the opposite direction. We say, what's the big goal? What are we trying to do here? What does success look like? In a perfect world, what should this be? And then we work backwards to say, all right, in order to achieve this perfect world, what are the required outputs? In order to get the outputs we need, what behaviors does that look like or require? And then we ask the questions. What tools and equipment are required? And do they have the right tools and equipment to produce the outputs? Do they have access to the information they need? What's the work environment look like? And there's lots of components to the work environment. Sometimes we think that's cultural, but a lot of times it can be, how is it set up? How many steps do people have to make? Do they have to go outside their office to get something, come back in, right? Do I have good internet connectivity? That kind of thing. Are there standards? And then, have I brought the right people to do the job? Okay, do they have the right skill set? All right? Sounds simple, like common sense, but common sense isn't always common practice. All right, this is where you need that blank piece of paper. Take out a paper and a pen, and I want you to write a list of activities, and then write a list of what you think a performance would be. So write like 4 or 5. 4 or 5 activities, 4 or 5 performances.
Can you elaborate? Yes.
No, I can't, actually, because that's part of the exercise. You do. So the question was, could I elaborate on what's the difference between an activity and a performance? And my response was, no, I will not elaborate. We're going to get to that. I don't want to steal my own thunder, right? Okay. Write down a list of activities, list of performances. And you in virtual world can do the same thing out there. And it's okay to be wrong. You're just going to write what's at the top of your head. The first thing comes out of your mind is good. You know how you succeed? Fail early, fail often. Anybody heard that before? Make little mistakes that don't have a lot of risk. We learn more by our failures than our successes. So take a risk here. Fail early, fail often, potentially. All right. Anybody want to share what they wrote as a performance? Come on, we got some risk takers, don't we? Thank you, ma'am.
Initiating a new case, is it accurate and is it complete?
Initiating a new case, is it accurate and is it complete? Okay? Anybody else? How about an activity?
Answer the phone.
Answer the phone is an activity. That's a good one. Any other activity?
Jury orientation.
Jury orientation, okay. Sorry?
Schedule a hearing.
Schedule a hearing, okay.
Speak to the public.
Speak to the public. Activity or performance?
Activity.
Okay. All right. So here's my list. Well, let me ask this question first. Rewards or activity? Rewards for activity or performance. Does your organization reward activity or does it reward performance? In order to answer that question, we need to know the difference, right? But I'm seeing some people go, we do activity, we do perform. I'm not sure, right? So let's talk about that. Activity. So sticking with some of the things we talked about, provide feedback on performance. That is an activity. What's the performance? A productive employee. That's the result, right? That's what we're after. So when we talk about do you reward activity or performance, not all activity is bad, right? Sometimes activity results in a performance, but sometimes we just get stuck in the activity. There was a great, from the 2016 election, without getting political, it was Hillary Clinton and Carly Fiorina, who I think that's her name, right, was the CEO of HP. And Hillary Clinton was saying her accomplishments as being Secretary of State was, I traveled 1 million miles around the world. And Carly Fiorina, CEO of HP, who understands before, she jumped on that, and guess what her response was? Sorry, that's an activity. That's not a performance. Right? So there's a big distinction. You traveled, great, but what did you do? Okay? So take a practice. Any golfers in the room? Okay, take a practice swing. That's activity. What's the performance we're really after? Put the ball in the hole, right? And then we can go to season to taste, right? A delicious meal. Study for class or take courses. And big college-age kids, mine have fortunately made it through all that. But, I have some that, 7 years was their best year as a sophomore or whatever it may be, right? So we're good at taking classes. We're good at going to school. But we may not be so great at graduating. We want the graduation part. You can see the rest, but I'm going to go to sweep the floor because that one is near and dear to me. As a kid, my dad had a hardware store. And I was working in the hardware store probably from age 12. And I hated it. You can see, I have 4 brothers. None of us went into the hardware store. I think my dad was okay with that. But one of the first things we had to do when we showed up at the hardware store at 7 o'clock every morning was sweep the floor. It was probably a 10-minute job. I could do that for an hour and a half. Right? Because I didn't really want to do anything else. And it was one of those big, long industrial, floor mop things. And I'd just go around the aisles, just kind of taking up time. For me, that was good. But what did my dad want? He wanted a clean floor, and he wanted it in 10 minutes. Right? So I was good with the activity. My dad, who's looking at the dollars and cents and wants to run a profitable business because he has 5 other things he wants me to do, he wants a clean floor. So do we reward the activity or do we reward the performance? And that's a question only you can answer, but it's a very important thing that we distinguish between. Okay, there are some core competencies like anything. This afternoon in this room, we're going to look at the NACM core in relationship to the model I provide you, but also we'll focus more on the workforce management competency. Okay, and see how that sort of fits within the model. But if you look at this list of competencies, they are the performance improvement competencies, But do these apply to the courts? Absolutely, probably in a more generic way, but do you need industry awareness or judiciary awareness? Absolutely, right? Do you need some leadership skills? Yeah. Does this apply to the medical industry? Yeah. Does it apply to manufacturing? Yeah. Okay, so these are core competencies are great. What we find, though, is we repackage and repurpose those competencies to fit our specific industry. Okay, but they're really more or less the same stuff. Okay, we're going to play another game because I like games. I'm going to count to 3, and I'm going to put up a picture. So it'll be like this: 1, 2, 3. I'll put up a picture, and here's what you have to do. In your best yelp, anybody know what a yelp is? No one knows what a yelp is? Anybody here from Scandinavian descent? I believe it's Scandinavian. So in your best yelp, I want you to yell fact or fiction. So it would be 1, 2, 3, and you're going to go fact, or you're going to go fiction. And if we do this right, there's people next door on that side. If we do this right, these walls should go for a second, okay? And I know they're doing something next door because I heard them testing the sound earlier. Okay, so whatever comes to your mind, fact or fiction based on the picture. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Fiction. Wow. That hurts me a little, but okay. All right, good. Let's try it again. There was a little delay there, too, sort of that ignosecond where we're thinking about what's next. 1, 2, 3. Fiction. Really? Anybody from the Northwest?
Oh, their stories.
Yeah. I actually did this presentation for some clerks out in the Northwest, and I added that just for them. And it was very surprising what I heard when I did the picture. Charlotte, North Carolina may not resonate as much. All right, here's your last chance. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Well, who said fact? Tell me more.
It just seems like it's either easy or hard, so it would be a fact that it's easy.
Okay, and you said fiction?
No, I said fact.
Okay, who said fiction?
Fiction, there is no easy button.
So the answer was there is no easy button, and yours was
That it's either easy or hard.
it's either easy or hard. Okay. All right, anybody else have a different take on that? Okay.
Button exists.
The button does exist. And I've given this presentation so many times and used this easy button so many times it no longer exists. It no longer works. But when I pressed it, it would go, that was easy. That was easy. So what's the idea? Brilliant marketing campaign for Staples. What's the idea behind the easy button? They can make it happen. Anybody else take on marketing and advertising people in here? It's a solution to every problem, right? It doesn't matter what the problem is in your organization. Come to Staples and we will solve it, right? Brilliant marketing campaign. How's that work in reality? Not so great. We work in complex systems and complex organizations, and we know that often there is no silver bullet or an easy button, even though it has a physical manifestation right here. So I'm not here to talk about the easy button. But I do want to talk about the idea behind the easy button. And often where we see the easy button used is if there's something goes wrong in the organization. We often give knee-jerk reactions. Frequently that can be training, but not always. So we need to do something. And often when we do that something, it's more of a cover our CYA kind of thing, cover our backside. So whatever the issue is in your organization, we need to be careful not to press whatever our de facto easy button is. Training, something else, okay? yelling at people, firing people, screaming, whatever that may be. Because training or the easy button does not equal performance, okay? All right, this is where I'm going to present a model. And I need to tell you that all models are wrong, including the model I'm about to present to you. Wait a second, where is this guy coming from? All models are wrong, including the one I'm about to present to you. Why is that?
Varying factors, there's variation.
Variations, varying factors. Anybody else have an idea?
They're based on a set of assumptions that may not be true.
Based on a set of assumptions that may not be true. Okay, well, what's a model? What is a model? Think of when I was a little kid, I used to build tanks, right? Those little plastic tanks you'd glue together. What is that? It's a representation of something else, right? That model. But does that model have an engine? Do I put gasoline or diesel into that model? No. It looks like a tank, but what if I stepped on it? It's going to fail, right? That model is going to fail eventually. So all models are wrong because they're simplifications of reality that we mere mortals need to try to understand something, to break it apart, maybe dive into a specific piece of it. So all models are wrong, but some are useful. Okay? So I'm hoping that you'll find this model useful. Here's the model. It's called the Performance Factors Model, or PFM for short. Anybody heard the term PFM before? Yeah? What's it stand for? Pure freaking magic. Right? And this may not be pure magic, but this is a model I developed while I was in the Coast Guard. It's a model they use today. And everything in the gold, we say, are organizational factors. So that's information, resources, incentives, selection, and assignment. Those things are under the authority, control, and responsibility of the organization. Largely management. How many people said you're managers? Half, at least half the group, okay? That's good. Everything in silver are individual factors: knowledge, skills, motivation, and capacity. We say those are under the authority, responsibility, and control of the individual. Let's dive into the model a little bit more. So when we talk about, and those are the buttons, right? Those are the organizational buttons. When we talk about information, we're talking about some of the most basic and seminal information every organization should have. What's our vision? What's our mission? What are our values? What's the policy, doctrine, okay? Job descriptions, maybe a little feedback program on those job descriptions, some type of performance management system, okay? There's lots more, but that gives you a very basic idea. Then we move to resources. And again, the same for all organizations, regardless of industry. We have people, we have tools and equipment, sort of your capital buildings, that kind of thing. Everything from paper clips to an office building. We all have exactly the same amount of time, regardless of industry. Money may vary on how well we're funded or how well our organization is capitalized. And then there's processes. Are there things that we do that are proprietary just to this organization? Okay? And that may not apply as much to the courts, but in some organizations it does. Then let's look at its incentives. And you notice maybe there's a vertical relationship to some of these, not all of them. There's a vertical relationship to information and knowledge and incentives and motivation, which we'll talk about in a second. So when we talk about incentives from an organizational perspective, we can think of these as, you've seen the picture of the mule, and there's a carrot in front of them to get them to move in certain ways, to keep them walking forward. And then sometimes there's a stick on the backside as consequences. The carrot's the incentives. What does the organization dangle out in front of us to keep us moving in a certain direction? Pay and bonus. What's that structure look like? What's our vacation and paid time off? Sometimes we can reduce that and increase that, and that doesn't cost us a whole lot of extra money, right? Titles can be very important, or promotion opportunities. Office space. Anybody come from a law firm? No? Okay, good. So you don't know if I'm lying. But I know in some law firms, your office space is critically important. And whether you get a bare floor, a throw rug, carpet, or wall-to-wall. To the point where if you're a vice president or a senior vice president, you get wall-to-wall carpeting. Anything below that, you get carpeting that may be 1 foot off the perimeter of your office to just a little throw rug when you enter the office. I mean, that sounds ridiculously silly, right? But sometimes when you're walking around, you walk in and go, oh, that's full carpeting. I know who I'm dealing with. Right? True. Benefits. What are you talking about when we talk about benefits? Healthcare, right? 401k, HSA, all that kind of stuff. Profit sharing, probably not so much in this world, right? Telework. Maybe, maybe not. Are there opportunities for it? Maybe. Is the culture ready for it? Maybe, maybe not, right? I have that in my own organization. Okay, and then we look at selection and assignment. How do we bring people into the organization, and how do we distribute them across the organization? What prerequisites are there? How do we do interviews? And then once we've identified a candidate and we make an offer, how are we going to use them to the best ability, their best ability, for the benefit of the organization? Am I going to keep them right here, or I got to put them somewhere else? What kind of responsibilities am I going to give them? Okay, that's the top. Let's look at the bottom. Knowledge. And I mentioned there's a relationship between knowledge and information. Anybody want to guess at what that relationship is? Take a risk. Fail early, fail often. All right, I'll give you, there's a hierarchy here. We go from data to information to knowledge. What's the difference at each step? Value? Processing, okay. If I'm data, and now I make the leap to information, what's happened to me? I've been organized, right. Now I'm information, and I make the leap to knowledge. What happened to me? I was synthesized, applied maybe. Let's think about this from storage or repository. Let me go back. Where is information stored? It's on the slide, in the organization. Where is knowledge stored? Between my ears, right? So data is organized so that it becomes information. Information can be structured, chunked, so that it is more easily transferred to knowledge, and the organization can do that, but ultimately it's up to me, the individual, to determine what penetrates my cranium and is stored in long or short-term memory. Okay? That's why it's an individual factor. Lots of things the organization can do to expedite that and help that, but it's ultimately up to me. So we can think of this being external, internal. How about skill? That's the tactile or mental ability to complete a desired and valued behavior. And the example I give there is to diagnose and fix the flux capacitor and get us all back to 1984 when I was young and handsome. Okay, just young. Right? So, but there's some things I need to know about the flux capacitor before I can fix it. So there is a time that knowledge is a precursor to skill. What does the flux capacitor run on? Come on, I'm old, but some of you are kind of there with me. Nope. Garbage. Flux capacitor runs on garbage. So I need to know, as I'm diagnosing and fixing the flux capacitor, do I have the appropriate garbage with me to make sure I can fuel it once I start tweaking it? Okay, but it's sort of the magic I can make out of my fingers to do something, or my decision-making ability. But with that, there is an understanding that knowledge is a precursor to performance or being able to do something. I mentioned relationships. Let's talk about motivation versus incentives. Anybody want to take a guess at that one? I often hear people saying, we're having a problem because I just need to motivate them more. Yes, you may be able to incentivize somebody. Coaches say, I need to motivate them. And, there's a fine line there. But it's more, let me explain it a little. Someone's going to say something? No? Okay. I cut myself off. So value, we're talking about values, purpose, that inner fire in the belly. Why do I exist? Why do I get up every day? Why do I think I'm on the planet? What am I supposed to do with my life? That's the motivation piece. Now, where this becomes critical, if I can hire somebody who has motivation that's aligned with the incentives of the organization and aligned with the vision, mission, and values of the organization, what does that get me? A highly engaged employee. And HR folks talk about employee engagement all the time. Employee engagement is a huge factor in determining whether or not someone's going to stick around your organization. Okay? And that doesn't have to do with a whole lot of money. Yeah, there's some money issues up there. But if we get this part right, we bring in the right people, that's huge. And I will argue, based on my extreme years of experience within the courts, whole 3 years not working in the courts, but I would argue with any organization, if you undersell this, you're making a big mistake. And I think we undersell this. Look at what we do. What we do is critically important to our democracy, right? If folks don't do what you do, what happens to the United States? Chaos. But do you talk about that kind of stuff to your staffs? I don't know, maybe you do. Let me give you a quick example of this. Not court-related, ship-related. I was the executive officer of a ship, okay? And so as the executive officer, you're in charge of heads and beds and morale and discipline and that kind of stuff. And aboard ship, we have this thing called the galley, which is where everybody eats. The cooks also cook all the food in there. But right next to the gallery is this miserable, awful place called scullery. Anybody know what scullery is? It's where the dishes are all washed, right? It's where the dishes are washed, and they just come at this person fast and furious. And who do we put in scullery? The most junior person to the ship. We put him in scullery. Prove your worth. And what happens? They get in lots of trouble because they hate their work. So I saw this happening, and I said, there's got to be a better way. One, we're not going to put the most junior person in scullery. We're going to let them be on board the ship for a month to see how we operate and how we run things. And then before they go into scullery, they're going to meet with me. And I'm going to tell them how important scullery is. And let me tell you how important scullery is. It controls the hygiene and sanitation of the ship. If those dishes don't get washed on time, the cooks don't have what they need, the pots and pans and plates and all that stuff to feed the crew, which makes for a very angry crew. And if you're in charge of morale and discipline as the XO, that's important to me, right? And if they don't clean them right, we get sick. You can take down the entire crew in about 12 hours. As soon as I told them that's what they were responsible for, the welfare and sanitation and hygiene of the crew, and I told them this is going to be miserable. You need to know this is not going to be a glamorous job. It's going to be hard. But here's how important it is to what we do in the operations of the ship. As soon as I made that little tweak, things changed. This was not a big problem for us anymore. So it's giving them, someone said value somewhere, right? It's making them understand the value proposition of what they do. Even if it's the most seemingly menial, nasty job on the entire ship, it has tremendous importance. And I think we can do a better job in relaying that information to the people that work with us and for us. Okay, I spent a lot of time on that. Next thing is capacity. And here we're talking about physical capabilities, but also all that stuff rolled up into one. Okay? I have a son who's a pilot in the Coast Guard. And as he was applying to flight school, there was a visual requirement, 20/20 vision, right? Can't be a pilot without 20/20 vision. There's also a requirement that he's not so big, he's about my size actually, but he couldn't be so big that he couldn't fit in the cockpit of an aircraft, and he couldn't be so small that he had to sit on a stack of phone books to see over the dash, right? Phone books, a bit of an anachronism, I know, but they exist. All right, so where are those sticky notes? Why is this important? Because I spent a lot of time on this. Well, there's data out there, several studies that have been done on where do performance problems exist in organizations. And depending on the study, it says that 65 to 74% of the problems are attributed to management. Congratulations, managers, you're screwing up your organizations. Again, show of hands, how many said you were managers? Maybe a little fewer. All right? So if almost 3/4 can be attributed to management, that means far less can be attributed to the individual worker. Yet, we frequently try to fix the worker. So this is about the point in the presentation where people say, Dave, I don't believe you. You're full of you know what. And usually you're right. Okay? But let's see what you said. Remember when you wrote down the biggest thing that kept you from doing your performance? Here I have something that says technology. Where does that fit? Right, resources. Effective communication. Information. Bingo. We won't do all these. We'll do these enough so you get an idea. Not enough time. Communication. Let's take one. Technology. I'm not making these up. Approval from managers. That's a good one. Tell me more about that one. Anybody want to volunteer? No? Okay. All right. So approval from managers could be a lot of things. Do I know what they need me to do? Do they sign off on what I'm doing? Does that take too long? Is the process broken? But we're saying managers, so let's say it's definitely in the top, right? So it may be somewhere in here. Okay, it could be an incentives issue. All right, I get this one every time I do this for the courts. Judges. Any judges out there? Yeah, so whose was this? What do we mean by this? Okay, fair enough. Different, right? Maybe what we're trying to do is not what they're trying to do, right? And yes. But I think that is an interesting point, and it was one of the things that struck me. Again, this is based on my military background, but my job as a military officer was to develop the people who came behind me. In essence, to put me out of business so that after several years, they could do my job and I would move on to something else. Okay? So you and I was evaluated on how well I developed the people that worked with me and for me. That was part of the job. That was totally understood. I don't know if that exists the same way in the court system. This one doesn't say judges, but it's kind of the same thing. My supervisor. All right, we'll do two more. I'll take one from the bottom. This one says resources and time. All right, and remember, this is before you saw the model. Prior court employee in a different role. Someone want to tell me about that one? Sometimes we have to peel back the layers on these. These are like onions. We've got to peel back a couple layers to get at what we're actually talking about. This could be not a prior, say again?
I was just thinking in that sense, maybe they don't want to change, or this is how it used to be. I used to get that a lot.
Okay, so where would that, under your scenario, she was saying it would be saying this is how it should be done or was done, and I don't necessarily want to change or adapt to the new way of doing business. Did I summarize that correctly?
That's what I interpret that.
Okay, yeah, yeah. So where would that go based on?
I think it's motivation.
Motivation.
They're not motivated.
Could be.
They don't want to change.
Okay. All right, so you get the idea, right? It may not fit perfectly with 65, 74, but again, this was just quick. I think we're probably pretty close. And this works out. I've done this probably 75 times, and this is what we get. The problems are in the organization. The problems are in the process, the system, the leadership on how we're doing things, not the people. People get up every day and they want to do good work. They want to add value. But often the organization gets in the way. And we ask people to adapt to this crazy system instead of having the system restructured to support the work we expect people to do, right? Or to support the work that supports our customers. Do we have customers in the court? We do. Do we talk about customers in the court? Some places maybe, some places not so much. But organizations, by and large, deliver a product or a service of value to a customer or a constituent. And if we think about it in that context, that we are maybe not a business, but we're an organization that provides a product and service, it might change the way we think about things a little bit. Okay? I said when I was on active duty, I wanted to run things like a business. Now, I didn't have P&L responsibility, profit and loss responsibility, but I wanted to think about things from an efficiency and effective standpoint so that we could do the best we could with the resources we had. And those were your taxpayer dollars. All right, let me get rid of these. We'll collect those later. All right. So this is what that looks like in a graph, a pie chart. That's a lot. 75% of the problems are attributed to management or the system. All right, we already did that. Here's another way to look at things. If a performance factors model is too much for you, I want you to get the idea of a systems perspective, that everything is interdependent and interrelated. So if I think about, or your courts, and I divide it into the work, what gets done, what has to happen, the worker, the people that are doing it, and the workplace, the environment it happens in, with performance being in the middle, if I change any one of those factors, if I move that little cog a little bit to the right or left, what happens in this model? It changes everything else, right? It certainly moves performance, but it moves the other two. I can't think about these things in isolation. They are interdependent and interrelated. So if I change one part of the organization, by default, I change the other. Let me give you a real quick analogy. I think we got time. I live in Southeast Virginia. Southeast Virginia is the home of Newport News Shipbuilding. They are the only manufacturer or company in the United States that can build nuclear-powered aircraft carriers. Enormously complex machines. There's a lot of welding that happens when you build an aircraft carrier, right? So there's lots of what we consider blue-collar trades. I used to do knuckle-dragging blue-collar trades, but that was probably offensive to somebody. Sorry if I offended somebody out there. Yet, it's a very high-tech company. I mean, an aircraft carrier is high-tech. Well, they got to a point where they're trying to improve some things, and when you do all this welding off-gases awful things, right? Depending on the type of metal you're welding. So they wanted to find a better way that would protect the welders, but also allow them to go into places where they couldn't get before. They were just too tight. And I lost my mic. They were too tight, too constricted. So they developed these little welding robots. Okay, so they're changing the work. Now, who is a likely person to operate the robot, the welding robot? Yeah, or maybe a welder, right? They would know what a good weld looks like. So maybe I have to send them and they become technicians, or they become maybe more of a high-tech worker. They're operating, fixing this welding robot. So they get some additional school. I skill them up, right? But if I change enough of them, now maybe they get associate's degrees or even bachelor's degrees. I change the environment. There's a different expectation on what I'm paid, how I'm treated in the work environment. And this should sort of blow your mind, like, wait a second, I just wanted to make welding better. But by changing the work, I changed the worker and I changed the workplace. So we have to think about these things They're interrelated and interdependent. All right. So what's the goal here? It's to raise the overall performance in your organization. So if this is the standard performance curve, this is average performance. Everything to the right here is exemplary performance. Everything here to the left is minimum performance, meaning they're not meeting the standards. What do I do with this group that's to the left of the minimum performance line?
Retrain, reassign,
Replace.
Maybe. That is what we may do. That's what we probably do. What should we do? We will do that. We'll do that at some point. Yep. Let's say we do remediation, we retrain, we put them on a performance improvement plan, and they still are here. What do we do?
Replace.
Yeah, that's what we do sometimes. We try to fire them as quickly as possible without getting sued. That's what we do. And it's the without getting sued part that becomes the problem. Right? Right, that's why they remain, or we transfer them. I saw this all the time when I was on active duty. Very hard to fire a federal or a state employee. They know which buttons to press to keep their jobs, even if they're not doing their job. All right, so, but the goal is, if we were for-profit, we want to get rid of them as quickly as possible, because a lot of times they're poisoning the well, right? They're just not making work fun. So let's get rid of them. And sometimes I say it's worth the risk. Get rid of them. How about these people that do it better than anybody else? Let's say it's a salesperson, and I have one salesperson that's selling 10 times more, bringing in 10 times more revenue than anybody else. I want to figure out what they do differently. How do they approach the sales call? How do they prepare themselves? How do they initiate contact with the person they're going to sell to or the business they're going to sell to? How do they provide advanced information? How do they make the call? How do they ask for the business? How do they follow up the business to keep getting those sales? And if I can distill that down into some nuggets, whatever the job is, so whether it's a clerk or somebody, staff that works for you, we're going to look at that job. And if I can distill that down into some nuggets, I can spread that, share that, train that with the rest of the organization, which moves the entire performance curve to the right. And that's the goal, right? To move everything to the right, to improve performance. So, that's the model. What's the value of the model? Well, I believe it's a tool to keep you focused on the highest leverage areas. Okay? It's non-jargon. I haven't used a lot of, high-tech terms here. I believe it resonates with managers. I've given this to 4-star admirals. I've given this to presidents of companies. I've given this to line managers. Some of them, it was like I gave them fire, right? And it's a common sense approach. Unfortunately, common sense is not always common practice. All right, so 3 learning points. Performance problems are frequently caused by the organization or the system and attributed to who? Managers. As managers, it's our responsibility to make sure the system supports the employee or the individual. It's cheaper and easier to fix the organization in the long run. It may be cheaper to do the job for this person who's not doing it once, but in the long run, it's cheaper and easier to fix the organization. We continue to fix employees rather than the organization. How did this get screwed up? You screwed this up. Let's retool. Let's redo something. Let me tell you another quick story. Outside the courts, this is in banks. A bank was having problems with customer service. So they trained all their tellers, back in the day when we actually went to a bank, they trained all their tellers in customer service. Now what's involved in that? You've got to reschedule people, you've got to take them off their shifts, put them in training. So they gave them like 20 hours of customer service training. Put them back out on their teller shifts, surveyed them 6 weeks after to see what customer service was. It was still awful. So they went and did it again. Second round. We're going to train you better this time. We want you to be friendly to the customers. Okay, great. Spent all the time, spent all the money, got them back out, did the training. 6 weeks later, they surveyed the customers. Customer service was still awful. They got desperate, and they called somebody like me with my background. And they went in and they started looking at this. And if you talk about how does work happen, remember that slide? Where do we look at it? What's the big goal? Well, they looked at how these people were evaluated. What are they supposed to do? They were evaluated, their performance was evaluated based on how long their line was, how quickly they got people through the queue. That doesn't create a lot of time for chit-chat. So how do you fix that? You make a standard where these customer service surveys are going to be part of your review. Simple. We added a line to their evaluation, to their performance review. Interviewed people 6 weeks later. Guess where customer service was? Where it needed to be. It was good. They were actually being nice to the customers because they were being evaluated on how nice they were to the customers. This is not rocket science, right? But if we think about it from the perspective of how work gets done and what behaviors we're asking for, it can make a big impact. Okay. This model was built on the work of others. I can't say it's all mine. This guy, Tom Gilbert, developed something called the behavior engineering model back in 1978. And all other models, including mine, are adaptations of that. In some ways, we repackage and repurpose that model. That concludes the presentation. We do have a couple minutes if you have questions. I'd be happy to take them. Yes?
Unlike the private sector where you may have a long-term CEO, stakeholders who have a common vision that spans over 10 years, let's say. In our work, often the visionary changes with elections or appointments.
Yep.
And so that becomes, how do you get past that challenge when the mission is always the same, but the vision has a tendency to change every 4 years,
Okay.
every 7 years, and you want to keep everyone who's below, managers and line staff.
Great question. So the question was, when we have changing people at the top, how do we keep this idea of aligning performance with the vision? The mission may not change, but people want to make their own stamp on things when they're elected and they change every 4 years. I can tell you that in the military suffers the same problem, right? Admirals rotate every 2 years sometimes. The key is in your vision and mission, the mission may not change, the vision may, you give them that opportunity to tailor it a little bit. But as long as that's happening, some places it's not happening at all, right? I've looked around some of the courts and at missions, I see lots of mission statements. I don't see a lot of vision statements, so good on your court for having a vision statement. Because the vision is this compelling vision of the future, this ideal state that we may never achieve. The mission is what we do every day to achieve that, right? And the values are our personal behaviors and ethos on how we execute the mission. So you have to have some flexibility. But if you've done it really, really well, like you bring in the whole organization, a vision statement can last over the term of one person. You've got to let them buy into that, obviously, and let them know the amount of work that went into it. The other thing I see with these, with vision, mission, and value statements is we do them to check the box. And so we did that, and it goes on a wall, and no one pays attention to it. The real value of those things is they determine how we do business every day. When we have to make a hard decision, we take that vision statement off the conference room, and we put it on the table and say, what did we say we were going to do? Right? So it's part of your behavior every day. So no one answer for that, but if you've done a very big effort, you can talk to them and say, hey, we just went through this. We believe this is good. We'd like you to buy into this vision statement because a lot of hard work has gone into it. And if we just change it, I think it could cause more problems than good because the organization has bought into what we're doing here. All right? An authentic conversation, I call those. Any other questions?
I was just going to say, I was one of those. I came in December of 16, and they'll tell you, they say I came in like a hurricane. So I don't know that, they're slowing me down sometimes.
Rock you like a hurricane, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So did you redo the vision and mission statement?
I don't know if we actually physically wrote it down, but we know we have goals. There's technology goals and a lot of goals. But there's a lot
Slow down. Slow down. Yeah. Well, so there's an interesting point to that, too. You need to understand, if your term, hopefully you'll stay in your court for a long time, but in the military where you are rotating every 4 years, you need to be careful how big of a bite at the apple you take in that 4-year period, because you're only going to be able to get so much done. And that's really in the middle 18 months. Once you're a year out from transferring, they're like, well, we're just waiting for the next person. And then the first year, you're sort of gaining buy-in and trust in all that. So it's really the middle section is where you can make things happen. Any other questions? No? Okay. Well, thank you for choosing to spend part of your morning with me. I have some cards up here if anybody would like to talk further. Thank you all again.
I know that there's still a debate out as it relates to the stapler or Staples Easy. But once you still decide on that, I'm glad that Dr. Hartt has given us some tools to utilize as it relates to the easy button, using a common sense approach. As it relates to your app, please make sure that you go in and rate the presentation. It really will help us give some positive feedback as it relates to our future conferences. Thank you all so much, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.